Lyndon B. Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, led a life filled with ambition, controversy, and power. But in 1973, when he died of a heart attack at the age of 64, the official story was clear: natural causes. However, questions remain. Was his death truly the result of a health condition, or could there have been something more sinister at play? Could the man who once controlled the fate of a nation have had his own fate controlled by forces beyond his understanding? In this video, we'll dive into the mysterious circumstances surrounding Johnson's death, the theories that challenge the official narrative, and explore the darker truths that could lie beneath the surface. Stay tuned to uncover what others have missed about LBJ's final days. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with the latest investigations. Lyndon B. Johnson, affectionately known as LBJ, was one of the most pivotal and polarizing figures in American politics during the 20th century. His presidency, coming in the wake of the tragic assassination of John F. Kennedy, thrust him into the highest office of the land, a position he would navigate with a unique blend of ambition, pragmatism, and at times ruthlessness. But while Johnson's time in office was marked by great political achievement, such as the Civil Rights Act and the War on Poverty, his legacy was not without its dark sides, particularly his handling of the Vietnam War. Yet, despite his complex legacy, one of the most enduring mysteries about LBJ remains not his policies or political maneuverings, but the circumstances surrounding his death. On January 22, 1973, LBJ died at the age of 64 from what was officially termed as a heart attack. The story, as told by the press and government officials, was simple. A man who had spent years at the highest echelons of power, a man who had lived with the immense stress of running a country embroiled in one of the most divisive wars in its history, had succumbed to natural causes. However, upon closer inspection, the official narrative begins to unravel, revealing a web of intrigue, contradictions, and unaddressed questions that linger to this day. Could LBJ's death have been something more than a natural occurrence? Was there a deeper, darker story hidden behind the closed doors of the Johnson family and the corridors of Washington? To understand the circumstances surrounding LBJ's death, it is essential to first examine the man himself. Born in 1908 in a small town in Texas, Johnson rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most influential politicians in American history. His career was shaped by his Texas roots, a combination of ambition and raw political acumen that made him a force to be reckoned with in Washington. But LBJ was not just a career politician. He was a man deeply shaped by personal demons and profound political pressures. His early years as a congressman and later as a senator in the 1940s and 50s provided him with the experience and connections needed to ascend to the presidency. Yet, as much as Johnson's rise to power was built on hard work, charm, and political deal-making, his tenure as president was also defined by contradictions and chaos. The Vietnam War, one of the defining elements of Johnson's presidency, would come to haunt him until the end of his life. He inherited the war from Kennedy, and by 1965, he had escalated the conflict, sending American troops into Southeast Asia in an effort to prevent the spread of communism. The decision would be one of the most controversial in modern American history, dividing the nation and shaping Johnson's political future. The war was not only a political disaster, it took a profound toll on Johnson's personal life. The pressure, stress, and public backlash over the war left him a deeply weary man. In 1968, with public support for the war crumbling, LBJ announced he would not seek re-election. He had been worn down by the relentless political battles, the Vietnam conflict, and the mounting toll on his health. The years following his departure from the White House were not kind to LBJ. Although he had officially left politics, the wounds from his time in office were still fresh. His personal health was in decline. Johnson had suffered from a variety of ailments over the years, many of them related to his stress levels and his well-documented heavy smoking and drinking habits. By the time of his death in 1973, LBJ had endured multiple heart issues, including a history of high blood pressure and a severe heart attack in 1955. This history, along with his lifestyle, provided the basis for the official narrative of his death. Yet there were many who were not convinced that his death was simply a result of a failing heart. At the time of his death, Johnson had been living on his sprawling ranch in Texas, far from the public eye. He had retreated from the spotlight after leaving the presidency, though he remained a prominent figure in the political world. In the days leading up to his death, those closest to him reported that Johnson was in poor health, struggling with his breathing and showing signs of physical deterioration. On January 22, 1973, Johnson was found dead at his ranch, having suffered a heart attack. His death was mourned by the nation, and the official cause of death was confirmed as a heart attack. However, some of those closest to him began to raise questions about the circumstances surrounding his death. First, there was the timing. The death of LBJ came at a moment when the political landscape of America was in the midst of a significant shift. The United States was deeply embroiled in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal, and the nation's political and social fabric was being torn apart by scandal and corruption. The Vietnam War, which had been the defining issue of Johnson's presidency, was still fresh in the minds of the American people, and Johnson's involvement in the war remained a subject of deep controversy. It is not hard to imagine that LBJ, a man who had spent much of his life surrounded by power, intrigue, and pressure, might have found it difficult to live with the weight of his legacy. Could his health have been pushed to the breaking point not just by natural causes, but by a personal decision to end his life in a moment of despair over his own political legacy? While it remains impossible to prove definitively that LBJ's death was not entirely natural, it is worth examining the various theories that have emerged over the years. Some have suggested that Johnson's death may have been the result of foul play, possibly orchestrated by political rivals, or those who sought to prevent him from ever revealing the truth behind his role in key events, such as the assassination of John F. Kennedy or the escalation of the Vietnam War. The theories range from the plausible to the outlandish, but the possibility of external factors contributing to his death cannot be entirely ruled out. Perhaps the most compelling of these theories centers around the possibility that Johnson's involvement in the Kennedy assassination could have played a role in his death. Many have long speculated that LBJ, who was known to have ambitions of becoming president long before he actually took office, might have had a hand in the conspiracy to remove Kennedy from power. These theories suggest that Johnson's political machinations, which were often ruthless and manipulative, may have extended to his pursuit of the presidency. If such a theory were true, it would follow that LBJ, having come under scrutiny after Kennedy's death, may have been under increasing pressure to keep certain secrets hidden. Another theory revolves around the idea that Johnson's involvement in the Vietnam War may have contributed to his early death. It is well documented that Johnson's decision to escalate the war was not only deeply unpopular, but also damaging to his health. The constant stress, political pressure, and public backlash over the war took a toll on Johnson's physical and mental well-being. In the years following his decision to step down from the presidency, it's clear that the war had left deep scars on his health. Was it possible that Johnson's health deteriorated further due to the psychological weight of his decisions? While we may never know the full truth behind LBJ's death, one thing is certain. The man who once commanded the greatest office in the world was never far from controversy, even in his final days. And as we look back on the legacy of Lyndon B. Johnson, it becomes clear that his death, much like his life, remains shrouded in mystery and intrigue. What we do know is that LBJ was a man whose time and power left deep marks on the American political landscape, and the events of his final years continue to raise questions that may never be fully answered. In the months leading up to his death, Lyndon B. Johnson's health had been a matter of public record, though not many seemed to notice the signs of his declining condition until it was too late. By the time Johnson passed away on January 22, 1973, at his beloved ranch in Stonewall, Texas, his life had already been punctuated by a series of physical and mental battles. Yet his last years, lived out in near seclusion after leaving office, were also filled with an overwhelming amount of political intrigue and potential motives that could have resulted in a far more complicated end than the simple heart attack the world was told. Throughout his presidency, Johnson's health was a topic often mentioned, but seldom explored in depth by the media. For many, LBJ's weight issues, heavy drinking, smoking habits, and apparent stress were seen as typical symptoms of the toll the presidency took on those who served. And yet, for all the attention that was given to the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, and Johnson's ambitious legislative agenda, his personal health seemed to be an afterthought, until it couldn't be ignored any longer. As president, LBJ had faced considerable pressure in virtually every area of his life. The war in Vietnam was undoubtedly the most defining and controversial aspect of his tenure, and it took an incredible toll on his physical and emotional well-being. By 1968, the pressure was so overwhelming that he chose not to run for a second full term, citing his inability to bring peace to Vietnam as the primary reason. This decision was an unusual one for a sitting president, and it marked a dramatic retreat from the public eye. Johnson left Washington, retreating to his Texas ranch, but his personal struggles were far from over. The subsequent years in the private life of LBJ are often overlooked, but they provide important clues that could suggest a deeper connection between his psychological health and the physical decline that ultimately led to his death. Johnson's withdrawal from public life was not a peaceful or quiet one. By the early 1970s, LBJ had become increasingly reclusive. He struggled with both physical ailments, including recurring bouts of high blood pressure and heart issues, as well as deep psychological turmoil. His public persona, once that of a bold, decisive leader, had given way to a man who seemed to be racked with guilt and regret, particularly over the Vietnam War. Those who were closest to him during this time report that Johnson frequently spoke of his failure to bring peace to Vietnam, and he was deeply affected by the growing public dissatisfaction with his decisions. The memories of his time in office, particularly the acrimony that had defined the Vietnam War, appeared to haunt him, and his health suffered as a result. The stress of the war had already taken a toll on his physical condition during his presidency, but his decision to retire from public life seemed to amplify the damage. Johnson had suffered from a number of health problems throughout his life, from a serious heart attack in 1955 to high blood pressure and persistent weight issues. Yet, his declining mental health after leaving office seemed to exacerbate the physical problems he had already been dealing with. When Johnson passed away in 1973, it wasn't unexpected to those who had observed his deteriorating health, but it was also not the natural event it appeared to be on the surface. The official cause of death, a heart attack, was widely accepted, but the true nature of his health, both physical and emotional, raises questions that have been largely ignored by mainstream historians and journalists. For a man like LBJ, who had spent the majority of his life on the world stage, achieving one of the most powerful political positions on earth, the idea of being reduced to a private citizen after leaving office was devastating. His relationship with his legacy was fraught with contradictions. He was both proud of his accomplishments, such as the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which permanently reshaped the social and political landscape of the United States, and simultaneously burdened by the damage he believed the Vietnam War had inflicted on his country and his own career. There were also other, less conventional ideas about Johnson's declining health. Some have pointed to his personal relationships and political maneuvers as potential factors that could have played into the manner of his death. Theories suggesting political or external factors influencing LBJ's demise abound, though many remain speculative. One of the more persistent theories is the idea that Johnson's connection to the Kennedy assassination may have had a greater impact on his life and death than most realize. The assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963 remains one of the most enduring mysteries in American history, and the role that Lyndon B. Johnson played in the aftermath is a subject of ongoing debate. Johnson, who ascended to the presidency after Kennedy's death, was often rumored to have been part of a larger conspiracy to remove Kennedy from office. While there is no concrete evidence to suggest that Johnson had any direct involvement in the assassination, the political maneuvering that followed has led some to believe that Johnson's ascension to the presidency was more than just a matter of fate. LBJ's own ambition, coupled with his ruthless political tactics, has fueled speculation about his role in the events surrounding Kennedy's death. By the time Johnson left office in 1969, the wounds of the Kennedy assassination and the ensuing turmoil of the Vietnam War were still fresh. LBJ had already been under scrutiny for his role in escalating the conflict in Vietnam, and his political enemies had not forgotten the circumstances that led to his rise to power. If there were those who wanted to silence Johnson or prevent him from revealing uncomfortable truths about his past, they would have had ample motivation to do so. This idea of a man under constant threat of exposure could have contributed to his health problems, creating a vicious cycle of stress, fear, and isolation that only worsened with time. One of the key pieces of this puzzle lies in the circumstances surrounding Johnson's death. In the official account, LBJ died in his sleep at his ranch in Texas, surrounded by his family. His wife, Lady Bird Johnson, was there with him when he passed away, and his death was attributed to the same health problems he had been dealing with for years: high blood pressure, heart disease, and the consequences of a life filled with stress and poor lifestyle choices. Yet, the timing of his death has raised eyebrows. Johnson died just as the political landscape was undergoing dramatic changes. The Watergate scandal was brewing, and the political environment was rapidly shifting. Was there a larger conspiracy at play, one designed to silence a man who had become a liability to those in power? Some conspiracy theorists have pointed to the idea that Johnson's death was not just a result of natural causes, but was instead the result of a deliberate effort to remove him from the political scene once and for all. They argue that his role in the Vietnam War, his connection to the Kennedy assassination, and his troubled legacy had made him a target for those who wanted to ensure that he never had the opportunity to speak out about the secrets he may have known. While there is no definitive proof of foul play, it is worth considering the possibility that LBJ's death was not as straightforward as it seemed. Could the man who wielded so much power during his presidency have been taken down by forces beyond his control? Or was his death simply the result of the accumulated toll of a life lived in the political spotlight? As we examine the facts surrounding LBJ's death, we are left with more questions than answers. His life and legacy remain deeply intertwined with the political history of the United States, and his final days are shrouded in mystery and intrigue. Whether his death was truly natural or the result of more sinister forces, one thing is clear: Lyndon B. Johnson's life and the manner of his death continue to captivate the public's imagination, leaving a legacy that may never be fully understood. In the decades since Lyndon B. Johnson's death, the mystery surrounding his passing continues to intrigue historians, conspiracy theorists, and even the general public. While the official story has remained unchanged, a natural death from a heart attack, many remain unconvinced, asking whether the truth has been obscured by political motives, or if there is more to LBJ's final days than has been acknowledged. To understand the implications of his death, we must look beyond the surface and dive deeper into the socio-political context of the time, the lasting consequences of his presidency, and the powerful forces that shaped both his life and his eventual demise. The aftermath of LBJ's presidency was defined by political fallout and a deeply divided America. His final years in the White House were marked by his controversial handling of the Vietnam War, which led to unprecedented levels of social and political unrest across the nation. By the time he left office in 1969, Johnson had become a deeply polarizing figure. The Vietnam War had escalated beyond all expectations, and the public's once strong support for the war had dwindled to near zero. The toll this took on Johnson, both personally and politically, is hard to overstate. The stresses of handling the war, coupled with the vitriol of his political opposition and public outcry, made LBJ's later years a dark and often solitary time. But his withdrawal from the public did not equate to a life of peace. Instead, it became clear that Johnson was living with both the psychological and physical scars of his presidency. By the early 1970s, Johnson was reclusive and ailing, living at his sprawling ranch in Stonewall, Texas, far from the political spotlight. However, his retreat from Washington did little to quell the questions that had followed him throughout his time in office. His health was a concern to those closest to him, but there were also rumors, theories, and whispers about a man who had lived a life full of ambition and ruthlessness, and how those same traits may have played a role in his final moments. Johnson's heart condition, which had plagued him for years, was the leading cause attributed to his death. He had suffered from a heart attack in 1955, and his health had been in steady decline since the late 1960s. His high blood pressure, coupled with an unhealthy lifestyle that included heavy smoking and alcohol consumption, only exacerbated his condition. However, as with many aspects of Johnson's life, there was more to the story than simply the medical details. To understand the broader context of LBJ's death, one must first look at the intense pressures he faced during his presidency and afterward, and the toll these pressures exacted on him. The Vietnam War was undoubtedly the most devastating aspect of Johnson's presidency. His decision to escalate the conflict had led to the deaths of thousands of American soldiers, and his handling of the war had alienated vast swaths of the American population. Anti-war protests, civil unrest, and a general feeling of disillusionment with the government had taken root across the country. Johnson's decision to step down from running for re-election in 1968, rather than face another bruising campaign, was a clear indication of how deeply the war had affected him. In private conversations, Johnson had acknowledged the immense burden the war placed on him. As much as he was a skilled politician, his conscience weighed heavily on him, and the sense of failure he carried after leaving the White House was palpable. After his departure from office, Johnson's health continued to deteriorate. His mental state, however, was arguably even more fragile than his physical condition. In the years after his retirement, Johnson spoke candidly about the regrets he carried, particularly over the Vietnam War. According to those who were close to him during this time, LBJ would often express his frustration and sadness over his inability to end the war or bring about peace. It seemed as though the weight of his own legacy, combined with his declining health, led him to a place of isolation. He had become a man disconnected from the world he had once ruled, a figure haunted by his past actions. Yet, while Johnson's physical and psychological decline were evident, there were also those who believed that his death could have been tied to more than just natural causes. As with many political figures of his stature, there were always questions about the true nature of his actions, and conspiracy theories about his role in key historical events continued to emerge, particularly regarding the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The theories surrounding Johnson's potential involvement in the Kennedy assassination have been a persistent and controversial subject for decades. LBJ's sudden rise to the presidency after Kennedy's death has long fueled speculation about his possible complicity in the plot to kill the president. While there is no concrete evidence to support the idea that Johnson had any role in the assassination, the notion that he may have been aware of, or even part of, the conspiracy is a theory that refuses to die. This dark cloud of suspicion about Johnson's involvement in the events surrounding Kennedy's assassination would continue to follow him throughout his life. Though it was widely accepted that Johnson had nothing to do with the actual killing, many were not so certain about his role in the aftermath. Johnson's political maneuvering following Kennedy's death, including his actions during the investigation into the assassination, remains a subject of deep scrutiny. Could LBJ have been involved in a cover-up? And could the stress of maintaining such a lie have contributed to his deteriorating health? The psychological toll of living with such a burden is often underestimated, but it could have played a significant role in his eventual demise. Compounding this psychological strain was the pressure Johnson faced from the political establishment in the wake of his presidency. As one of the most powerful men in America, LBJ had made enemies in nearly every corner of the political landscape. Those who were critical of his role in the Vietnam War, as well as those who resented his political maneuvering, could have been seeking to diminish his influence or even silence him altogether. The prospect of powerful figures with motives to eliminate or neutralize LBJ looms large in any discussion of his death. Though no solid evidence exists to suggest that anyone was directly involved in his passing, the possibility of external pressures playing a role cannot be entirely dismissed. Indeed, in the final months of his life, Johnson had become deeply paranoid, and his private life was marked by a growing sense of vulnerability. He was often seen as a man who felt he was under siege, whether by the media, the public, or the forces of history. By the time of his death, Johnson had withdrawn into a near-complete isolation, surrounded only by a small circle of family and friends. It's also worth noting that his death occurred amid one of the most turbulent periods in American political history. The Watergate scandal was unfolding in Washington, and the country was increasingly disillusioned with its leaders. LBJ had lived through both the height of American power and its decline, and it is possible that the combination of regret, paranoia, and ill health may have led to his sudden demise. The official narrative, which attributes Johnson's death to a natural heart attack, still stands. However, when looking deeper into the context of his life, career, and the immense pressures he faced, it is hard to dismiss the possibility that there were more factors at play. Was Johnson's death truly the result of years of poor health, as we are told? Or could it have been a product of the unrelenting psychological and political pressure that he endured, both during and after his presidency? Was LBJ's heart the only thing that failed him? Or were other forces at work in his death, forces that were never fully explored or understood? Lyndon B. Johnson's life and death will likely remain shrouded in mystery, despite the extensive historical record surrounding his career and legacy. As the nation looks back on the tumultuous era he helped define, the unanswered questions about his passing only add to the intrigue of his story. The man who once wielded unimaginable power, whose decisions shaped the course of history, died in relative obscurity, leaving behind a legacy that continues to provoke debate, discussion, and perhaps suspicion. And so, as we attempt to piece together the puzzle of LBJ's life and death, we must confront the possibility that the truth may never be fully revealed. Like many complex figures in history, the ultimate story of Lyndon B. Johnson is likely to remain incomplete, an enigma wrapped in layers of political, personal, and historical context that may forever elude us.